Welcome. My name is Eugene Meyer, President of the Federalist Society. Welcome to the second of our 6 panels on COVID and the law. We're delighted to be doing these and covering a wide range of issues, from federal state government role to elections to civil liberties to regulation. And this panel is on federalism and the law. The full bios of all of our participants are on our webpage, fedsoc.org. But they'll be introduced here. And to do that and to moderate the panel, I want to welcome Kay James, who is the president of the Heritage Foundation and who has had a long and distinguished career, service on many boards, doing all kinds of things. You can look that up if the details if you want to. But without further ado, I want to thank Kay for doing this and welcome her. Kay?
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon. As you know, this topic is very important to me and has occupied quite a bit of our time at the Heritage Foundation over the last several weeks. I also chair the National Coronavirus Recovery Commission. We thought it was so important at the Heritage Foundation to look at both the health and the economic consequences of the virus. But today, we're here to hear from 4 very distinguished legal scholars, and they'll be joining us on the panel. I have a couple of questions that I hope our panelists will address today, things that we wrestled with on the commission. Have governors overstepped their legal authority with their stay-at-home orders, and what federal rules or regulations have been an impediment in this crisis, and what should be done about them. There will also be an opportunity for questions from you after each of our guests speak. When we get to that portion of the discussion, I'll remind you that if you're on Zoom, hit the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen, or press *9 to ask a question. So let's get started. Let's dive right in. I'd like to introduce each of our very distinguished panelists. I know that you can see their more extended bios, but just to tell you a little bit about them. Professor Rick Hills teaches at the NYU School of Law and writes on constitutional law and federalism. His recent work has focused on the politics and policy behind the centralization of banking regulation, the president's role in suppressing states' immigration policies, and the advantages of decentralization in education. Dan Farber is a professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley, and the faculty director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. He was also a Supreme Court law clerk for Justice John Paul Stevens. Professor Farber has written extensively on constitutional law, environmental law, and presidential power and the Constitution. Karen Harnett is the executive director of the National Federation of Independent Businesses Small Business Legal Center, where she deals with issues relating to employment law, including unionization and immigration. Prior to joining the Legal Center, she was an attorney specializing in food and drug law, representing businesses and trade associations in front of Congress and federal agencies. Jonathan Adler is a professor of law and the director of the Center for Business Law and Regulation at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law. He's also the author of or editor of 7 books, including Business and the Roberts Court. Professor Adler is also a contributing editor to National Review Online and is a regular radio and TV commentator on constitution and regulatory issues. Welcome to each of our panelists. Now, each of our panelists will deliver opening remarks, about 8 minutes, and then I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to our audience for their questions. So let's start with Professor Rick Hills from the NYU School of Law. Professor Hills? I think he was joining us by phone.
He was, and I think he may have lost his connection.
Well,
Uh,
that's
so maybe.
fine. I will come back to him. And why don't we go ahead to Professor Dan Farber?
It's a pleasure to be here today and to have the opportunity to talk about these issues. I think that this is an area where ideological divisions may not be as strong as they are on some other issues. They certainly exist, but I think that there's a fair amount of consensus about the general division of authority between the federal government and the state governments in this area, at least under the existing statutory scheme. And I think most people agree that response to the coronavirus and other epidemics is primarily at the state, given to the states. There are federal statutes that do apply and that give the federal government and the president significant powers, but those statutes are largely designed in terms of supporting a state response, not replacing it. I think some of the other speakers, like Jonathan Adler, will talk about some of the advantages of this system in terms of federalism. This system allows for experimentation in different jurisdictions. It allows people with different preferences in different kinds of communities to have different kinds of policies. That's one of the standard advantages of federalism, and I think it's true here. Different communities may have different views about how to handle trade-offs between controlling the disease and economic costs. In general, federalism tries to allow local communities to set their own policies based on their own preferences. And that may be especially important today when the country is so polarized, so there are really big differences in how people approach these things. And of course, circumstances differ in different parts of the country too. New York was long the hotspot in the outbreak, although that seems to be getting better, whereas there are other parts of the country that may be rural, may have had very few cases, and are really in a different situation. It's important to remember, though, that there are also downsides to decentralization. One of those downsides takes the form of spillover effects. If one jurisdiction fails to properly control the spread of the disease, that doesn't just affect them because people move around and have contact with people in other jurisdictions, and that disease can spread. On the other hand, as I think Kay James was maybe alluding to, if some jurisdictions are too strict, then, and more than is appropriate or necessary, then that has economic impacts that also affect national markets and have effects elsewhere. And really, dealing with spillover effects is one of the main reasons that we do have a federal government. Striking a balance between giving room for local autonomy and experimentation and preferences on the one hand, and dealing with all of the different spill effects, setting that balance, I think, can be a complicated problem. But I think the current statutes clearly resolve that problem largely in favor of local decision-making. There may even be some constitutional restrictions, at least under the Supreme Court's current jurisprudence, about how much Congress or the president could do. Getting sick is not a commercial transaction, so under cases like Lopez and Morrison, federal regulatory authority may be limited to some extent in that area. Going out and getting vaccinated or something like that, or going back to work, is pushing someone into a commercial transaction, And that may be a little bit on the edges of federal power given the Sebelius case. I'm not saying that there are clear constitutional limits. I think those are kind of fuzzy, but I think the constitutional doctrine does reflect at least a set of assumptions about what kinds of things are typically federal and which ones are typically state. We may need to have a more nuanced approach to decentralization here to try to set some guardrails on what states can do, either in failing to respond sufficiently or arguably in over-responding. I don't know that we have good mechanisms in place for thinking about those guardrails under current law. Of course, whether individual governors may have gone too far under state law is something that's going to have 50 different answers for 50 different states. I think it does seem that although state governments don't necessarily follow the unitary executive theory, in this area they do follow by and large seem to follow the idea of strong executive power and a strong chief executive, but obviously there are differences between states, and we've seen already litigation on this. I'm sure we're likely to see more, if not now, then maybe if there's a resurgence of the problem. I wanted to say also a little bit about the tort liability issue that I know Karen Harnett is talking about. Again, I think there are some ideological predispositions here, but I think at least that should not be the driving force in thinking about federal legislation. There are a bunch of questions we need to ask. One of them is under this Federalist idea: is this an area where states should be free to experiment? Tort law is traditionally a matter of state law, not federal law. Is there a reason to federalize this particular problem? It's possible that there is, if the economic repercussions are big enough, but I'm not sure that we know that at this point. And it does seem at least some states are taking action in various spheres to limit tort liability, especially where healthcare providers are involved. I'm not sure that at this point we have reason to think that states will fail to take appropriate steps. I think we have to remember that tort law can serve positive functions, at least according to tort scholars. It can, for one thing, compensating innocent victims, and for another, deterring negligent conduct. Those presumably operate here. They may need to be balanced against other factors. I'm somewhat skeptical, but open to persuasion that there's a serious problem here. Employee claims are governed by workers' compensation, not tort law, by and large. And my understanding is that recovery under workers' comp for communicable diseases is actually very difficult because of the problem of proving that you got the disease in the workplace and not somewhere else. That's also going to be a problem for tort suits by consumers or other people who might be exposed due to a business. As I say, I'm open to persuasion if we see signs of a flood of ill-founded tort liability. So it may be that Karen Harnett could turn me around on this issue. But I do think that at least the discussions I've seen so far haven't had the kind of evidence that I'd be looking for. In summary, I think that many of us can appreciate from the coronavirus the advantages of federalism. Those of us who think that a really strong, stringent response is required can take satisfaction in living in states where governors have done that. People who feel that that's an overreaction have the advantage of living in states where the governments may be reopening earlier or may not have taken such strict action in the first place. That's definitely a plus. Whether the spillover effects will turn out to outweigh those pluses is something that remains to be seen. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Dan, and I look forward to the question and answer portion of our time together. I want to see if Rick is still with us or if he was able to rejoin. If he is, I'll go to him while we still have a good signal.
Hey there, can you hear me?
I can, and I hope we all can.
So anyway, here I am in beautiful Paducah, Kentucky. And for right now, it looks like I can talk to you all as a disembodied voice. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'll speak quickly because who knows when the internet will cut out again.
It sounds like it may have.
The question of how to manage emergency powers. In my mind, emergency powers raise a distinct problem of federalism because emergency powers are powers exercised by executive leaders that are prone to abuse. So they have high downside risk. A question might be whether it makes sense to have a federal regime in which emergency powers, that is to say the power of an executive to override law, to suspend law, and to impose purely executive policies, should largely be subnational emergency powers, lightly supplemented by national presidential powers. In federal regimes around the world, you see a range of responses to how to divide up executive emergency powers. The basic gamut is covered by, I think, Brazil, Canada, and the United States. In a state like Brazil, other states that are similar in Malaysia, the president has a lot of power to rule by decree under Article 136 and 84 of the Brazilian Constitution. The Brazilian president can proclaim a state of defense. That is subject to being overruled by the state legislature, by the national legislature. But in addition to that, the president has an ill-defined power to address, quote, urgent matters, unquote, under Article 62. And so that's a regime in which the central executive has a lot of power in response to something like COVID to step in and impose a purely executive policy. On the other extreme is the United States, where the president actually has very few emergency powers to suspend subnational laws. Almost all emergency powers are possessed by governors in large measure. The governors impose quarantines, the social distancing requirements, or stay-at-home orders. The president has a few powers to impose quarantines on national borders. Under the Defense Production Act, the president can commandeer production facilities, for stuff like personal safety gear. And the president has some powers to waive regulatory limits, like the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act limits, to promote use of experimental drugs. But largely, the president doesn't have powers to deal with the kinds of things that governors are dealing with, nor does the president have the power to overrule those gubernatorial policies. In the between of Canada, Canada does have something called the Emergencies Act of 1985, where the chief executive of the Federation does have the power to address urgent and critical situations that can't be, and this is the language of the statute, effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. And that largely gives the president the power to intervene if there's some demonstrable provincial incapacity to control something like COVID. But that power has never been used in the history of Canada, and it's widely agreed that it can't be used to address COVID right now because the provincial governors seem to have COVID well in hand. They seem to be doing the sorts of things that the chief executive of the Federation would do. Now, the last thing I just want to suggest is that the United States' highly decentralized regime of emergency powers is a good way to manage downside risks. And let me give you an illustration of those risks. There's a subnational downside risk, and there's a national downside risk. The subnational downside risk is that governors or states will not deal with spillover costs, or they'll impose some kind of local tyranny. A good example of that is Reconstruction South, where prior to Reconstruction, many Southern governments enacted black codes to discriminate against the African-American freedmen and other people they wanted to suppress. So you could have either local tyranny or spillovers from subnational emergency powers. The national downside risk is something like the Reichstag fire in 1933. Hitler takes over by declaring a national emergency. It's less well known that that was facilitated by a national suspension of oppression, a local provincial emergency. The provincial government in Germany in 1932 had been trying to deal with street fights between communists and Nazis, essentially by suspending rights of demonstration. And the von Papen government that preceded Hitler's got rid of those Prussian powers and indeed suspended the Prussian government in a very famous case, Prussia versus Reich, which the German Supreme Court upheld because the German Supreme Court, the Bundesverfassungsgericht, held that the Prussian government had to bring its emergency measures in line with the national executive policy. Well, in effect, what the German national government did is incapacitate the provinces from dealing with a national emergency, thus creating a chaotic situation that could justify national emergency powers that led to national tyranny. And the highest national downside risk is indeed unfettered executive power that sets aside the national constitution. Now, the possibility that the national government will suspend subnational emergency powers and thereby create chaos is becoming more and more realistic in countries like Brazil. Bolsonaro has interfered repeatedly with the governor's efforts to do something about COVID. The governors of Brazil have an 8-step program for dealing with COVID. And Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, has tried to invoke his Article 62 and 84 powers to suspend those COVID measures on the theory that COVID is not as dangerous as the governors of Brazil say it is. And so there is a danger that by centralizing responses to emergency, you might actually get rid of adequate emergency response from a national leader who's not taking the emergency seriously. Whether those conditions prevail in the United States is something that I'd rather leave to discussion. But I do want to point out that the constant worry about spillover effects because of lack of coordination between provincial or subnational governments has to be matched against the danger that the national government, for a variety of political dysfunctional reasons, might under-respond to emergency and use its power to supervise emergencies actually to suppress necessary emergency responses. That's all I have to say, and I want to leave the rest of the time for questions if there are any.
Oh, Rick, I'm sure there will be. There's a lot there to unpack and a lot more we need to hear from you. But right now, I want to turn to Karen. Karen, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks for having me. Yes, so I have represented for now 18 years the small businesses across this country at NFIB. And when it comes to federalism, honestly, they live it out, the benefits of it every day. Many of them have selected the places in which they do business based because they like what that state government has to offer as opposed to another state. There are some of my members, for example, that I can point to that might live in one state, but they choose to have their business in the bordering state for reasons that really deal with the restrictions on their business or what restrictions might be imposed. Overall, their view on government power is federal or state or local. They want as little of it as possible. They want to be able to run their business. And so when we look at the regulatory regime and its impact on small business, and when I'm talking about small businesses, we really focus on, our membership, which is primarily comprised of those businesses that have 10 or fewer employees. And so government mandates, regulations, whether they're federal, state, or local, always have a disproportionate effect on these small businesses because they have fewer employees with whom they can spread those costs. And it's the small business owner, not a compliance officer, an attorney, HR person that is, getting the company up to speed on what their requirement is for them and how to comply with it. It's the small business owner that is doing that work. And so what we see in our research is 50% of the regulations they find problematic come from the federal government, 30% from the state, 15% from the local. And that's why I have not been surprised to see that our small business owners have pretty much favored the Federalist response to COVID that we've primarily seen. They've liked the freedom that if they're in a state where there's less danger for an outbreak, it's a very rural state, South Dakota, they're not going to be subject to the same requirements as New York would be, and that their state government officials, whom they have a much easier way to hold accountable, more levers to keep them an account than they would to the far removed federal government. They have preferred that approach overall. There are two exceptions to that, one of which Professor Farber mentioned, which is liability reform. And on liability reform, what we have seen is 70% of our small business owners, and this is in a survey from last month, are their primary concern with reopening their business is liability. And I know that Professor Farber says that there might really be a potential liability epidemic, if you will. The answer is absolutely. For the small business owner, we 97% or 93% of small business owners do not ever go to court. They are the subject of what we call the bottom feeders of the trial bar. So they are the ones that would maybe come into a restaurant and measure, the tables. Are they exactly 6 feet apart? If they're not, they find out that client Joe got sick. He went into that restaurant. It's up to the restaurant to prove their innocence. What is that restaurant doing? They are going to, have to take time out of their business to fight this. They're not going to fight it in court. They're going to end up just writing a check. And we've seen this in the context with the Americans with Disabilities Act, with the Telephone Communication Protection Act, a number of different, with asbestos. And we really think that COVID in many ways it could present when you look at liability like asbestos, because where did you get it? All of those questions are very much out there. And so for that reason, we really think that an aggressive liability response is needed. I definitely commend to everyone on this call Michael Carvin's excellent article on why federal liability legislation does not interfere with Federalist principles and is constitutional. But in addition, I would just say, we would not favor, and I think most, even the larger businesses wouldn't favor preempting state tort claims. It's just setting a floor to make sure that everybody knows they're on equal playing ground. Because what about that, local small bicycle shop in Maryland, St. Michael's, that I've gone to before, that gets their parts from California? It is going to matter, when it comes to liability protections, that there is at least some nationwide floor. And so on that's an area where we think federal response is needed. I would also say that the small business owners that I've talked to and represent have really taken advantage of the payment protection program, the financial assistance that the government has given. This is not a community that typically goes to the government for financial assistance. In fact, they really didn't have much familiarity with agencies like the Small Business Administration prior to this epidemic. But because of how it hit so suddenly, and then all the spigots were off to their business, that has been a program that has been important for them. I would finally conclude by saying states are not immune from overreach, as Kay alluded to in her introductory remarks. We have absolutely seen that across the country, but have abilities, obviously, to fight it, not always successfully. California comes to mind, with the governor single-handedly rewriting the workers' comp standards so that COVID would be included. That's normally something that would be achieved through a legislative solution there, and we do think that he acted outside of California's constitution on at least that point, if not other things that he has done over this epidemic. And then Pennsylvania, when you look at who's an essential and who's not an essential business, as governors have really been in control of that question, who can even operate? Pennsylvania basically started out with nobody can operate, and then you can apply for a waiver, which did not work for the, hair salon. I mean, it doesn't work for the smallest among us, I guess. They're not going to have the pull maybe to get that waiver. And so that process we have had problems with. And then we've seen, obviously, in the news, the suits against Wisconsin's actions and Michigan's actions. So, but ultimately, when it comes to those questions, I do think that the small business community feels like they know where they can go. They know where they can go to at least complain and try to get some accountability. And that's a much farther and harder thing to do when you're going to Washington. And also with the Federalist experiment that we've been going through on this reopen, again, when you're looking at Wyoming, Idaho, who have yet to even, I don't know if they've even had 1,000 cases, why they should be shut down like New York makes no sense at all. And the fact that the states have had the freedom to move forward, we think has been a positive situation for them.
Thank you, Karen. And I would commend to you that in our research with the Coronavirus Commission, we really took a great deal of time to focus on the small business owners around the country. Professor Adler, we need to hear from you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I want to, I guess, briefly talk about is some of the benefits of federalism for dealing with a problem like a coronavirus and COVID-19. And to push back on some of the commentary that we've seen, particularly in some of the health policy literature, that suggests that federalism is part of the problem in trying to deal with COVID-19. Papers have been published pointing out that federalism allows for a disjointed response, different jurisdictions doing different things, and it's even been argued that this likely has cost lives and that more people have died or are dying because we have a decentralized structure. And I think that that is wrong for several reasons, and that actually looking at what we've been dealing with as a country, what the world has been dealing with, we should actually be thankful that we have the decentralized system. Some of the reasons for this have been hinted at already, but I just want to go through some of these arguments and explain why I think a decentralized structure like we have in the United States is a net benefit for dealing with this sort of problem. First, as has already been noted, states are different. And I think when we think about a problem like the spread of a disease and how it spreads, it's important to think about the types of differences across states that matter for the susceptibility of populations, for what sorts of measures make sense. States have different types of populations and different population density. States have different transportation networks in terms of relying upon mass transit or not relying upon mass transit. States have different climates. All of these factors are things that research suggests could be relevant in the spread of a disease like COVID-19. For example, the climate, whether or not the air is primarily dry or humid matters. Population differences matter. Household size and density appears to matter. And so the fact that states are different in these regards means that the way states should focus their resources and their efforts should also be different. As was also noted, I think Dan noted this, different states do have different values, different value preferences, different preferences for risk. As Alexis de Tocqueville noted years ago, in large centralized nations, the lawgiver is bound to give the laws a uniform character which does not fit the diversity of places and of mores. And the reality is, in a country as diverse as ours, we should think it natural that different jurisdictions may adopt different policy priorities. Insofar as we have these differences, a second reason why we care about federalism is that state and local policymakers are in a better position to be aware of those differences and to be aware of how those differences matter. Knowledge tends to be decentralized, and a one-size-fits-all national policy too often becomes one-size-fits-nobody. And so if we want policymakers to be able to account for local difference, we want to make sure that policymakers who are in a position to act have access to that information, and those at the local level tend to have greater access to that knowledge. Now, in terms of knowledge about the risks posed by a disease and how it's addressed, it's important to recognize that decentralized structures decentralized governance structures actually help facilitate the discovery and the creation of knowledge and information about these sorts of problems. Just as in a marketplace, a competitive marketplace, the fact that different entrepreneurs are trying different things, some are succeeding and some are failing, allows us to generate information about the most efficient way to organize and allocate resources. When it comes to governance structures, decentralized systems help generate information about what works and what doesn't. And that means learning both from what succeeds and from what fails. If one looks at what we talk about, what should or shouldn't be done in the case of a pandemic, note how much we point to prior history, and in particular, the fact that we have experience with different jurisdictions doing different things. A lot of the research comes from looking at the Spanish flu in 1918. And if you look at the key studies on what we learned from that outbreak, that research is based on the fact that different jurisdictions did different things, and we learned from that. And we need to allow different jurisdictions to do different things if we want to learn about the current pandemic and how it's different from prior outbreaks. So we've learned quite a bit, both from successes and from failures, about how to deal with populations that need nursing home care. We are also learning things that are different about COVID-19 than about the Spanish flu. So for example, research on the Spanish flu found that bans on public gatherings seemed to reduce the spread. There are noted outbreaks related to things like parades. With the Spanish flu, it appeared that closures of schools reduced the spread. Well, research just published in Nature, relying heavily on interjurisdictional comparisons of policies, doesn't seem to find school closures correlating with reduction in spread. And so we need different jurisdictions doing different things so we can learn how this pandemic, how this disease outbreak is different from those in the past. And I think it's important here that it's not simply about, do we have a stay-at-home order, do we not? Do we lock down or do we reopen? A lot of the important knowledge and discovery concerns the details, the texture of the measures. What type of stay-at-home order? What types of social distancing requirements? What types of measures are taken or not taken? And it's important to allow different jurisdictions to try different things if we're really going to generate the knowledge that we need to be able to deal with this sort of threat most effectively. A point that Rick made that I think is worth highlighting a little bit as well is that decentralization does reduce the cost of failure. If you put all of your eggs in one basket, if that basket fails, you fail for everybody. If you try to put your eggs in different baskets, well, then while that might increase the risk that you lose some eggs, it dramatically reduces the risks of an overall systemic failure. The federal government has certainly done a lot of things wrong with regard to COVID-19, and a lot of states have done some things wrong. But in a decentralized system, we've been able to benefit from the fact that at least some states have done some things right, and we've learned from that. And we see states rapidly adopting measures that appear to work that have been adopted by their neighbors. Bad policy at the federal level is nationalized. And if we make a mistake at the national level, then that's a mistake that we all bear the costs of. Another thing that's worth noting about in terms of decentralized system and relates to how we deal with failure is that in a decentralized political system like we have in the United States, when there is a failure at the federal level, the fact that we have decentralized power means that it's easier to push back and correct that federal failure. There's a really good example of that from my own state of Ohio. Battelle Labs, based in Columbus, has for years been doing research about how you sterilize medical equipment and PPE so that you can deal with potential supply shortages. And when COVID-19 emerged, Battelle Labs started looking at applying what it had been doing with regard to the cleaning and sterilizing of used protective equipment like masks to COVID-19. And they wanted to deploy this technology when they got it all ironed out. And the FDA stood in the way. The FDA initially didn't want to let them do it at all, and then wanted to let them do it only under incredibly severe and frankly arbitrary restrictions on the extent to which this could be used. And this meant that when we were dealing with PPE shortages, federal regulation, a federal failure, was standing in the way of measures that could save lives and that could protect frontline workers. because we have a decentralized system, because we have a governor like Mike DeWine who has his own, in effect, his own power base to operate from, there was an ability to push back. And the reality is that a governor of a state like Ohio is in a much better position to push back against a federal bureaucracy and help correct an error at the federal level than would the CEO of a business, than would a journalist, and certainly than would an academic like me. And Governor DeWine was able to make this an issue, and he was able to get the FDA to back down, get the FDA to acknowledge that it really had no good reason for trying to restrict what Battelle Labs was trying to do. FDA's position was basically that it's better for medical workers to have dirty PPE or no PPE than potentially imperfectly sterilized PPE. And when the absurdity of that position was pointed out in a way that they had to respond to, that error was corrected. And so that's another way in which having this federal system helps deal with error correction. The final point I just want to make is that when we're thinking about any system of governance and dealing with this sort of problem, we always have to avoid the Nirvana fallacy. We always have to avoid the fallacy of assuming that there is some perfect solution. I think a lot of the criticisms of federalism have assumed that the federal government, if given more power, would do everything right. And I think if there's anything we've seen from the last 3 or 4 months, that's certainly not the case. So my final point is, if you think the Trump administration has been inadequate or has failed in its responses to COVID-19, that's a reason for you to be thankful that we have the federalist system that we do, and that we have a system of decentralized governance that has allowed others to step in where the federal government has been insufficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. In the interest of time, I'm going to reserve my questions and would go straight to our audience for questions that they may have. Let me remind everyone that if you're on Zoom, you can hit the raise the hand button at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. If you're on your phone, press *9 to ask a question. I see that several are in the queue. You can either ask your question of an individual, or if you want each of the panelists to opine, please just say that as well. I'm going to turn to Eric Rasmussen first, and I would say to our audience that there may be a slight delay as his phone is unmuted. So Eric, the floor is yours for your question.
Thank you, Kay, for giving them that warning. I think you can hear me. Am I correct? You cannot see me, though.
We can hear you.
Okay. Well, I had a question based on my daughter being a Hillsdale College student. She says that the town of Hillsdale, Michigan, defied Governor Whitmire. The city government and so forth said, we're just not going to enforce any of these things. And Michigan is interesting because there's sentiment that since Detroit has a big problem, the governor is imposing a policy on the entire state that's inappropriate for everywhere else besides Detroit and the suburbs. So my question really for anyone is, if this is happening and what our governor is doing when the counties and cities are just saying, no, that's stupid, make us do it. One Michigan Airbnb cottage owner told me that he would love to rent to me, but his wife is a realtor and might lose her license. So that's one of the governor's powers that's happening. But what can a governor do to a city that just says no? That's the question.
Panelist?
I'll volunteer.
Go ahead, Rick.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
It depends on the state. In New York State, Cuomo has the power to suspend any local law because of powers that were conferred by statute upon him in March. And so under section 24 and 29 of the New York Executive Law, Cuomo can suspend anything that de Blasio does. It can suspend any local law enacted by the city council. In Michigan, the governor does not have those broad suspension powers. So it really depends state by state, and this goes back to something Jonathan said. One of the checks for gubernatorial power are state-level checks. I know that people worry that governors might be out of control, but they have to understand that in each state there's a panoply of checks. In Wisconsin, for instance, there is no Chadha doctrine. So essentially a single committee of the legislature can overrule a governor's executive decree. if that decree qualifies as a rule subject to a legislative veto. And in New York, there isn't such a doctrine, so it's harder for the legislature to overrule the governor. And so you can kind of see that there's experimentation not merely in the substance of how you deal with a problem, but also with the procedures and institutions that deal with a problem when you have a federal solution.
If I could just add one point to that, the question highlights a problem that we see a lot, which is policymakers, for understandable reasons, because they have limited information, often base decisions on a particular controversy or a particular problem that, for whatever reason, is most salient. Sometimes that's a function of what gets the most press attention. Sometimes that's a function of where a population center is. Sometimes it's a function of what the media is focused on. And a common cognitive mistake that is made by policymakers is to assume that a given problem is representative of the problems we see more broadly. And this isn't simply something we see arise in this area. Dan and I could probably go on and on with examples in the environmental context where very real problems that certain parts of the country are experiencing are mistakenly assumed to be replicated throughout the nation. And sometimes that might be true, but many times it's not. It might be that particular ecological conditions or particular industries that are in a particular place or particular population exposures mean that you have a real problem, but one that is not actually replicated. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, that just because something is on the front page of the Detroit News doesn't mean it's a Michigan-wide problem. It might mean it's a Detroit problem that requires a Detroit solution.
Right. Very good. Joy Stavely. Joy, are you still with us?
Is she muted?
Doesn't appear that she is muted. I tell you what, I'm going to go to the next question, and perhaps we can get the technical glitches worked out with Joy, and I'll try to come back to her next. How about Evan Walker Wells?
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
We can indeed. Go right ahead, Evan.
Hi. So I really appreciate a lot of this conversation, and I think one of the things that I just want to ask a little bit about is the alternative of a more involved federal government isn't necessarily that there's just a single rule for every single county or every single town in the country. And one of the things that's been interesting to see in the absence of a kind of more more robust federal government involvement that would address some of the problems like PPE distribution that Professor Adler talked about, is the way that, particularly in the Northeast, governors have formed kind of regional coalitions to try and come together. And I wonder if folks could just talk a little bit about that. I think, obviously there are a lot of scholars who have called for stronger regional involvement and kind of regional governance even in different parts of the U.S. for many years, whether that's focused on economic development or focused on different kinds of questions of economic mobility and opportunity. I wonder if you all could just talk a little bit about, what we may be seeing as the federal government currently is kind of stayed out of a lot of the kind of important parts of the public health drama around COVID. Is there an opportunity for those kind of regional governments to come together? And what's the downside of that? Are there things that such as monitoring the global health crisis, seeing COVID spread overseas before it came to the United States? Are there things that the federal government can do that even a more powerful, more robust regional infrastructure between the states and the federal government would not be able to do? And conversely, are there things that kind of regional infrastructure could do that the federal government really is not able to do effectively?
Dan, I'm going to ask you to take the first cut at that and then ask others to jump in.
Sure, thanks. I think that's a very interesting development. It's certainly not limited to this situation. We've seen some of the same things happening, for example, with efforts on some pollution problems and with, to a certain extent, with climate change policy, where states have made agreements with each other. Sometimes the federal government has pushed back against those, claiming that they violate federal law. Clearly, there seems to be a need for that in the coronavirus situation, at least in some circumstances. It's pretty hard to see how New York City can really deal with its problem without New Jersey being involved and maybe Connecticut. It's hard to see how the Washington metro area can be managed without some coordination between Virginia and Maryland and the district. So clearly some of that's essential. I think the limits are really where do we get to the point where a problem isn't just regional, or where the region is so big that it's just not practical to do everything together. I mean, you could imagine some kind of a regional agreement dealing with, I don't know, control of the Mississippi River, but that would be 2/3 of the states, so really you might as well at that point go to the federal government. And with COVID, clearly there are some areas where the federal government can make a unique contribution. One of them is with international issues, international travel, for example. Another area may be with interstate transportation. What kinds of standards do we want maybe to apply to airlines or other kinds of transportation? And there are areas where the federal government has a comparative advantage, for example, in expertise. Small states can't afford to have hundreds of medical specialists working for them and researchers the way the National Institute of Health does. And the federal government, and I think this is something that I think Jonathan would agree to, and even in areas where he thinks the federal government is overreached, that's an important federal role. And finally, funding, as Karen was talking about with the small business program under the CARES Act. I think that's an area, I think the federal government could have done more than it has to coordinate procurement of supplies. State governments have complained about a lot of wasted costs and effort competing with each other and trying to find sources of supply. The federal government probably could have done more. But one thing I think we need to keep in mind with this crisis, and is generally true of disasters, not just diseases, but things like hurricanes and so forth, which is these things hit home at the local level. They require local action, and it's state and local governments that are always going to be in the forefront in dealing with these situations. But specifically, I think there's a lot of room. There are some constitutional limits from the Compact Clause and so forth, but at least in my reading, they're pretty broad, and states have a lot of power to do this. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Were we able to get Joy back? I'd like for her to be able to ask her question if we can. Seems like we're still having a little problem there. So I'm going to go to Victoria Sharp. Victoria.
Yes, you are muted. Press Alt-A. Can you hear me? Okay, press.
We can indeed. Go
okay,
right ahead.
Wonderful. Okay, well, first, I wanted to say to Jonathan, I've read his book and I found it very enlightening. And two, as a small business owner, I'm sure Karen would appreciate this. I cross state lines all the time. I'm sitting in New York, but I go to New Jersey a lot. I go to school in New Jersey. And I have found during the COVID crisis that this topic has not been addressed. I think Jonathan alluded to a little about cooperation of the states, and maybe Dan too, but what about competition with the states? Because especially New York, New Jersey, I mean, there's all sort of a tension competition between the tri-state area. And, you know, if one state is having an issue like New York, which is many feel in New York is draconian, they will fly to another state. They follow the money, they follow the business opportunities. So what are the thoughts on how federalism addresses the competition between states in a emergency such as the COVID crisis? Thank you.
I would just add that here in Virginia, we have a very, very important model of that, where you have a city that's divided by a street in Bristol, and on one side of the street is Tennessee, and on the other side of the street is Virginia. And so we saw that played out in real time. Which one of you would like to address that?
I'm happy to start.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Competition is part of why decentralized systems work. I mean, that's where a lot of the incentives to do better come from. The reason that policymakers aren't complacent is not simply that they want re-election, which certainly helps, but that they know their prospects for re-election and their prospects for their jurisdiction being prosperous are a function of their doing well and doing better than the alternative. So in the context of a disaster or a disease outbreak, it's a somewhat unique or unusual context for those pressures to emerge, but those pressures are still there. And we've seen examples of businesses saying that they might relocate if state policymakers are not sufficiently flexible. Certainly, there's been a lot written about whether or not individuals are going to think differently about what parts of the country they want to live in based on these experiences, and that's part of how the system should work. So the competitive pressures are very important. And in terms of the prior question, that's actually one of the risks of regional cooperation if it takes the form of binding interstate compacts. And a quick plug, Rick and I were on another FedSoc a program a few months ago talking about interstate compacts. But the risk is that states sometimes are going to cooperate with one another because they are dealing with a common border or a common resource. So New York and New Jersey are going to figure out how are we going to deal with all these people going back and forth when we're trying to monitor and trace the disease outbreak and cases of it. But sometimes states might enter into agreements to collude. And just as businesses enter into agreements to collude with one another, we might see state governments try and do the same thing. And that's one reason why the Constitution requires that for interstate compacts to be binding, they require congressional approval.
Boy, does time fly when you're having fun. I can't believe that we're at the bottom of the hour. I would just ask of our panelists if there's a quick 15 or 20-second comment you'd like to make before we wrap up.
I can start. I would just say that I really do agree with what Jonathan just said on just how this, in many ways, this pandemic has shown the benefits of federalism and for all of the reasons people have said today, and that states are also learning from each other, and we're learning from different states, and from the small business, perspective. It has given many of them the freedom that they otherwise would not have had to return to business sooner, and that's actually critical to our economy as we move forward.
Can I interject here for just a second?
You can certainly interject because I saw the chat, and we are in fact going until 3 o'clock.
That's all.
Not that.
Yes, that was it.
And as well we should, because there's so much to talk about. But let's go ahead and do the whip around with our panelists. And let me frame the question again, and then I'll go back to questions from our audience. And that is, out of this discussion and the things that we've talked about, if you had to summarize and give what you believe to be the most important takeaway, what would that be? And then we'll go back to some questions from our audience. Jonathan, I'll go to you.
Oops, there we go. I think that in terms of the bottom line is that we're learning a lot about how to deal with this sort of problem, and that's because of our decentralized system, and that I'm certainly one that believes that the federal government has not done the things it could do, and has not taken advantage of areas where federal leadership might have been appropriate. And that makes it particularly valuable that we've had state policymakers and state institutions that could fill in the gap.
Dan?
Well, I said at the beginning that I thought that fundamentally these aren't ideological issues, and I think Jonathan has just illustrated that. We have very different philosophies about government regulation and fairly distinct views about questions like how that should work in the environmental area. But I agree with everything that he just said.
Fantastic. Rick, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. And I would have this one sentence to keep in mind, which is exactly the opposite of what Jonathan and Dan said. And I've been itching to pick a fight, so I might as well do it.
Go ahead.
National partisan. I think that emergency powers always raise deep questions of national partisan competition. And it's very important to understand that national partisan competition, that is to say competition between, in our system of first past the post elections, two major political parties, can really interfere with national emergency response. It's happening in Brazil with Bolsonaro. It's happened in Indonesia in 1975 with Indira Gandhi. It happens in state after state. Essentially, the national government will have an incentive to suppress subnational emergency responses in order to get a partisan advantage over governors who belong to a different political party. And it's a constant lesson from Nigeria and Malaysia, India, Germany, 1932, that national partisan incentive can really interfere with that technocratic response that Jonathan and Dan keep emphasizing. So if you decentralize emergency powers, you reduce the danger that national partisan competition will interfere with an emergency response simply because it tends to be less competition between major political parties at the state level. And so you can actually have a better unified emergency response if you avoid national emergency powers and keep them to the bare minimum necessary.
Interesting. Jonathan, you want to respond to that, or?
I didn't know if Karen wanted in on this. I mean, I actually agree to some extent. I mean, I think that partisan competition certainly helps. I certainly agree with Rick's point about the risks of how emergency powers can be misused. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm glad most of the emergency powers that are relevant for this sort of problem are in the hands of state governments. The federal government has some emergency powers. I know Dan's written quite a bit on the federal government's emergency powers, and they can be misused. And certainly I would agree that partisan competition does help constrain that, or at least, can help constrain that. Certainly it's an imperfect check.
Well, it makes for a far more interesting panel if I can get you all to mix it up a little bit. Karen, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I would only just agree that it really, what we've seen, for example, in Wisconsin too, is where the governor overreached, and you've got a split between what party's controlling the governorship versus the legislature. That's, again, just another way that you can have a lever to protect against, overreach and overuse of these powers. And then I would just also say more generally with this pandemic, the bottom line is whether you're, in a blue state, a red state, a Democrat, Republican, you want your businesses to survive. Presumably you don't want to go into economic bankruptcy and devastation. So it has helped, through this for, I think legislators of all stripes have been listening to, quite frankly, their business community, because they know that ultimately that's what's going to bring that state back.
Does our form of government and the documents that rule us provide sufficient protection against the political winds that blow, be they Republican and very, very red, or Democrat and very, very blue? Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, I think that again, in some of this, especially with, I would say yes, as far as the difference, again, with the Federalist system showing that in something like this, it really, we naturally gravitate because of the Constitution to a Federalist system to handle this pandemic. It really does, I think, diffuse as much as you can in these political days. I think that actually Professor Farber led with this in his remarks. Diffuse the partisanship that we see in so many other issues. I'm not saying there's not partisanship with regards to the coronavirus. Obviously, there is, but I think it would, like Professor Farber said, opening up because of our Federalist structure that the Constitution sets forth. That has really diffused that partisanship to an extent that it otherwise would not have been had it not been for that constitutional structure we have.
I see Eric Miller has a question. Can we turn to Eric Miller?
Can you hear me?
We can indeed. Go right ahead.
Well, an observation and a question. The first observation is that if you read state constitutions, the power in an emergency is not necessarily an inherent executive power, but it is something that we delegated through the legislative process. If the legislature hasn't spoken, it's arguable that the governor, certainly the local governments, would not have the authority that they appear to be exercising in the current crisis. So the question really is, as we go forward, what types of legislation or legislative initiatives can we expect at the state level to clarify not only the statewide executive authority in an emergency, but also at the local level? And for context, I'm calling from the state of Florida.
I'll start just by saying, first, as has been noted before, it's very much a state by state question, and how even these basic doctrinal questions about separation of powers actually are quite different from state to state, and are often very different at the state level than at the federal level. Just to give a couple examples of that, states like Ohio and like a lot of states don't have a unitary executive the way the federal government does. Many of our statewide office holders are elected separately and can exercise their powers independently. Some states have emergency powers presumed to be in the hands of the executive by their constitutions. Others, it's a function of the relevant statutes. And so it's very much a state-by-state question. The other thing I'll say is we've already seen several examples of where statutes that were written decades ago, perhaps in response to the 1918 outbreak, or perhaps in response to some of the post-war outbreaks, which were not as severe as 1918, but were certainly significant, we realize that some of those statutes are outdated. I know here in Ohio, we have language in our code about emergency powers that makes certain assumptions about incubation periods versus periods of communicability that made sense when focused on certain diseases, but may not make sense for COVID-19. And that's an invitation for the legislature to update those provisions, either by giving more discretion to the relevant executive agencies or by tailoring the way the powers are authorized or constrained in state statute.
I also have some information we received actually today that we've seen this in Pennsylvania, that just, I think it was either yesterday or today, their General Assembly has already enacted or passed by 44-6 a constitutional amendment that's going to limit the emergency powers of that governor going forward, because on a bipartisan level, there has been very dissatisfied with the governor's go-it-alone approach in that state. So we may see more initiatives like that moving forward in other states.
May I interject this? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Rick, and then I'll go to Dan.
I just want to make an advertisement for Miriam Seister's wonderful piece in Harvard Law Review, doing a survey of all governors' powers and how broad they are and how unchecked they are. It's a great synopsis. I know we keep saying it's a state-by-state thing, but if you had to do one-stop shopping, you can't do better than go to Miriam's work.
Fantastic. I would commend that to you. Dan?
Yeah, I have two things. One is to agree about this not really being a partisan issue. I know in California, where the Democrats, hold the state governor's mansion and dominate the state legislature is quite unhappy with the governor because they feel that they've been shut out of the process. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some legislation. The other thing is a little bit of a note of caution. There's a reason why executives have emergency powers. The kinds of reasons Alexander Hamilton talked about, and that supporters of the unitary executive are fond of talking about, which is the energy, efficiency, and speed with which the executive can act. And that's a danger for sure, and one that I worry about a lot. But it's also, in some cases, a necessity, right? And and that makes it really hard to make rules in this area because, on the one hand, we want to stop abuses and overreach, and that's critically important. But on the other hand, there are times when you just need that immediate action that only the executive can provide. And I do think we need to be careful in rewriting the rules to deal with issues of overreach, that we don't end up handcuffing executives in future crisis situations, whether at the state level or the federal level, that could result in, horrendous consequences because nobody at all is empowered to deal with an urgent problem, whether it's a natural pandemic, biowarfare, all the other kinds of crises that we can be faced with. So I think it's a difficult balance.
Eugene, I see you leaning in and leaning forward. Does that mean you have a question?
Sorry, I muted myself. I do indeed. Karen Harnan brought up the very interesting question, at least certainly for federal society members, I think for everyone, about, well, what do you do? What do you do about you'd like to have liability protection nationally, but is that justified? And I think she thinks it would be. Professor Farber, I thought very sensibly said, well, not clear how needed it is. My question, Professor Farber, is, by the time we figure out how needed it would be, might it not be too late? In other words, how much of the damage is done? And I don't know the answer to this, but how much of the damage might be done by the concern about liability, even if it turned out that there wasn't that much litigation? And what do we do about that?
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously that's an important question. I would think we would be seeing signs of that kind of litigation already, and so that's one place we could look. I think we could also be thinking about other solutions that might deal with the problem other than directly limiting liability. I mean, there are things that have been done in the medical malpractice area in the way of tort reform, in limiting damages or requiring mediation or other kinds of procedural things. We could also think about some kind of support for liability insurance for small businesses to enable them to weather this problem better. So I think there are a number of options. I agree that we would not want to wait until there was a tsunami of state efforts. But for some of the reasons that Karen and others have pointed out, I kind of think that it's unlikely that any state is going to want to be in that situation because states do have an interest in allowing their businesses to reopen and getting their economies going again. And that's one reason why I'm a little bit skeptical of the need for federal action, because I think state governments are really aware of this problem potentially. But yeah, we don't want to wait too long. But I would like to at least see the first signs that we're having serious issues, I guess, rather than just speculation.
May I just say one thing as a friendly amendment to what Dan just said?
Absolutely.
Yeah, the most important thing with tort law, in my view, as far as federalism is concerned, is good choice of law rules. As long as you have choice of law rules that maximally internalize the costs, especially the insurance costs, and allow insurers to price liability state by state, you can be reasonably sure that states won't try to price their own businesses out of business. The danger comes when you have long-arm statutes that allow litigation to be funneled into particular counties, such that the cost of insuring a business in, say, Mississippi does not actually reflect the liability law of Mississippi. With medical malpractice, because the place of injury is always the doctrine for the choice of law rule for the tort, you don't really have a danger that a pro-plaintiff forum can impose its rules on a pro-defendant location. But with other kinds of torts, you might have that, James, especially with multi-state enterprises. So the most important thing Congress can do is use its Article 4, Section 1 power to create good choice of law rules to internalize the cost of state tort law, and then just leave it to the state legislatures to figure out whether they need to cap damages or not.
I guess my concern with this particular level issue and liability is with small business owners. Again, 93% aren't going to court, and where it's very easy to threaten a lawsuit. It's very easy to file a lawsuit. And with COVID, you could just have a positive test and no physical injury and file, and again put it on the onus on the small business owner to show that they, were not the reason that you acquired COVID. And I guess what my concern is that a trial attorney saying, look, I would never bring one of these suits. I have no reason to believe that person isn't telling the truth. But that's not the type of trial attorney that is going after small business owners across the country. And if you look at California in particular, you can see hundreds, if not thousands of cases that have been filed against small business owners for Americans with Disabilities Act violations that were the result of a drive-by, go in, measure the guardrail in the bathroom and leave, never go back to the restaurant again. And that is the type of lawsuit that if we can have some barrier to entry, if you will, for these types of lawsuits going forward to protect the smalls, I think is really important going forward. I really do think this could end up being a very, very big problem and one under the radar, because these aren't necessarily going to be cases filed. These are going to be, I'll sue you if you don't pay me X amount of dollars in 15 days. That transaction is taken care of, and none of us are ever going to know about it. And that's what's got us very concerned.
Rick?
Yeah, but in response to that, it seems to me the place you should address your complaint is the state legislature, not Congress. In other words, of course, there are lots of frivolous suits. There's no doubt that tort law might need to be reformed. Sounds like California Assembly is the place where you need to bring that complaint. The idea of bringing it in Congress makes sense only if you think that the California legislature doesn't care about its own small businesses. And that can only be the case if the choice of law rules are not well tailored to make sure that Californians pay the cost of that excess liability.
Well, anecdotally, I can tell you that as chairman of the National Coronavirus Commission, this was one of the most commented upon sections of our report. And whether it is real or imagined, there is a great deal of conversation going on around the issue of liability. And I don't think that people have quite thought it through yet in terms of whether it would be best handled at the federal or the state level. So I think that the work and the conversation that we're having today is even more relevant based on that. I see another question from Eric.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, I'm an economist. So I'm one of Holmes's bad men. And when we were talking earlier, I brought up that Hillsdale was defying the governor. And Rick, I think, was answering that, well, in New York, it's different. There, the governor, the law says he has authority over the towns. And yeah, that's what the law says. But what is the law? So if the city of Buffalo says, our police aren't going to enforce your mask requirement, Governor Cuomo, what actually happens? Does the governor send in the National Guard at that point? and arrest all the police, or what? Or does nothing happen? In which case, Holmes would say, bad man would say, no, the law is that the governor has no authority over this kind of thing in cities.
Who'd like to take that one?
It depends on the state. I mean, that's, different states have different rules about the extent to which the state can override the decisions or actions that are taken at the local level. While all local governments ultimately derive their power from the state, different states have different doctrines, Dillon's rule, home rule, and so on, that determine when local jurisdictions and their decisions can be overridden, when they can be, in effect, commandeered by state officials. So it really depends on the state in question.
I'll just add as a friendly amendment that it also depends upon whether the law enforcement official is elected or not. Sheriffs are much more likely to resist a governor. In Texas, the sheriffs have been aggressive about asserting their authority than a municipal police chief who's appointed by a mayor. And so I think that even if a state allows some form of commandeering in theory, there's just not enough state troopers to handle the job that a sheriff would do. So as a practical matter, sheriffs in rural areas can, in effect, obstruct a governor, and sometimes they have.
Jonathan, did you want to add anything to that? Okay, well, I'm going to go over to Evan Wells next, but I would remind those of you who may have joined us a little later that if you have a question, go to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little hand there. And if you click on that, I can tell that you may have a question and make sure that you have the opportunity to ask it. So, Evan?
Hi, thanks for the double dipping on questions. I appreciate it. I would just start with something that maybe would be a little bit of a pushback about some of the concern on tort reform, which is that while I think it's very interesting to think of areas where federal government's early action might make a big difference and actually be beneficial as opposed to leaving problems to the states, I do think that the coronavirus epidemic as a whole reveals, there are tens, if not, significantly more thousands of Americans who are dead because of slow federal government action in this case. I'm in New York. One of the reasons why as you all may remember, Governor Cuomo briefly cried on one of his daily briefings about, his failure to act earlier. And one of the things that I wonder about there gets to a point that Professor Adler, you made before, which is that one of the benefits of having lots of different states and towns and cities trying different solutions is the ability to learn from each other. And I wonder whether we can, I'm curious for what sorts of solutions would help disseminate that kind of information both between states and cities and towns, and also when it comes to things like, the degree and seriousness of the spread of coronavirus overseas, before, while the federal government had a lot of that information, was not acting on it. And that information was not quite making its way, as I understand it, to governors and mayors. And as New York, I'm particularly upset given the number of people in my city who are dead because of that, and because of the federal inaction on that front. And I wonder if you all could just talk a little bit about understanding that federalism, when the federal government does not work very well, can provide this great kind of check. How can we develop systems that will be better safeguards for the kinds of situations where the federal government is not working well, and also may even improve responses when the federal government is effective and capable? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to start? Why don't I start with you, Karen, if you'd like to respond?
Sorry, I was having trouble with my mouse. I mean, I understand. I understand that there are people that have actually been injured, and that is not the type of liability that I am trying to protect against. What I am concerned about is that this epidemic is one that can be easily manipulated by the bottom feeders of the trial bar. So I just want to be very clear on that. As far as the broader question on what we can learn, I mean, I think that's going to be a critical lesson moving forward, is doing, like we did after 9/11, a deep dive into where the failures were. And then also when you look at the regulations and the regulatory obstacles that were put in the way of getting the government moving forward, whether it was CDC or FDA, as we're re-envisioning America in light of COVID, I think there needs to be a real re-examination of, do we want some of these regulations coming back? Were they more of an impediment than a help as we're trying to navigate this crisis on a national level? So I think there's going to be a lot that is going to need to be looked at there. And then I also think on the federalism side of it, looking at what states worked and what didn't. You're from New York, and I think there's a lot of concern that the governor there did not do right by his elderly population with those first calls he made with regards to introducing COVID back into the nursing homes, versus looking at how Governor DeSantis in Florida was laser focused on the same issue and really protecting and ensuring that those institutions were in lockdown. So yes, I think that's got to be a huge national conversation after we get through all of this.
Any of our other panel members want to address that?
I'll just a couple quick thoughts. One, on the issue of how do we get information to spread so that states adopt positive measures that other states adopt. It's a really important question. And there's a lot of academic research looking at policy diffusion, and we don't understand it nearly as well as we'd like to. What we know is that it happens. We know that states copy each other, and we know that states adopt measures that seem to be welfare enhancing in their neighbors. So we know what happens. We don't understand enough about what makes it happen. Certainly good information is very important. The spread of COVID-19 most likely could have been slowed dramatically had there been better information earlier. A lot of that deals with things, though, outside of the United States, insofar as China suppressed information and the WHO and CDC didn't either weren't critical enough or skeptical enough of that information, or didn't have independent sources of information. That said, certainly within the United States, the federal government could provide funding and encourage standardization of the way we report certain sorts of things, and that might help. But the reality is we don't understand policy diffusion across states nearly as well as we'd like to, but we do know that when we let it happen, it does happen.
Joy, I'm going to try one more. I'm sorry, is that you, Rick?
Yeah, but sure, go to Joy.
Well, Joy has been trying faithfully to ask her question, and I want to give one more shot at trying to make that happen. Seems like we're still having that technical difficulty. Joy, I do apologize if you can hear us. We'd love to hear your question. But Rick, did you have a final comment?
Just that it's this particular crisis of COVID has illustrated the distinction between two ways that policies diffuse. One is through foot voting, and the other is through benchmarking. Often people think that states compete by attracting residents who migrate to them for better policies. That's one way states compete, but limits on mobility make that a very limited way. Benchmarking is another way states compete. Nobody has to move. Instead, voters just look at the performance in different states and then judge their own officials by that rival performance. So there's no doubt that Ron DeSantis is very carefully looking at COVID numbers, and his voters are looking at whether those numbers compare favorably or unfavorably to Cuomo's. Indeed, their competition is not for voters, is not for migrants, but for votes. And one benefit of federalism is it allows you to benchmark your state against the performance of other states when you have something easily measurable, like, for instance, infection and death rates.
Well, unfortunately, this time, our time truly is up. And I want to thank each of our panelists. This has been a phenomenal conversation and a very important conversation to have. I think our founders and framers gave us a precious gift in our form of government. It's up to us to figure out how to use the gift that they have given us in a time of crisis And this discussion certainly has led to a better understanding of federalism and how it can work out in a crisis like this. I want to thank the Federalist Society for hosting this outstanding event. And Eugene, I didn't know if you had any closing comments.
I just wanted to thank all of you for participating, and thank you, Kay, for moderating. Appreciate it very much.